Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of the show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. As you can see, I have the world behind me, and I'm happy and proud of it. Today I'm going to talk about a couple things, but among those things I'm going to talk about the situation in Russia. People don't think about Russia that much nowadays, but Russia is becoming more powerful, not less. The post-Cold War era is almost over, and I will give you a little bit of context about that. And first, I'm going to experiment with my beautiful Google Earth in the background here. I'm going to click on this button, which didn't work. Oh, okay, it went away. All right, instead of that, I'm going to go try and focus in and see if I can find Moscow. Let's see if I can do it. There it is. And it's growing. Knows I checked this out earlier, so it has a big green spot there. And while I'm busy focusing in, I'll begin talking a little bit. Okay, doesn't seem to be working. Okay, and that's the beauty of live TV, live to tape, not live to live. And we're coming into a gigantic city over here. And this gigantic city, I believe, hopefully, is Moscow. Looks like I'm coming into a gigantic farming area, the outside of the city, and a gigantic forest. Okay, so what am I talking about now that I've tried this and it hasn't worked? Going to go back out to Russia now. I'm going to be talking about the Russians and the post-Cold War era. And of course, the president of Russia right now is a guy named Putin. And Putin is an elected president. They have an electoral system now. But he's an ex-KGB agent, and he acts like it. And he's a very, very interesting character, and a lot is going on right now. And among the things that's going on right now is a oligarch who is threatening a revolution in Russia. This story came out in an English newspaper, The Guardian. He is a refugee in England. He is one of the oligarchs. And who are the oligarchs? Let me explain a little bit about it. So the oligarchs are in Russia when it was the Soviet Union. The last leader of the Soviet Union was Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev made some agreements with Reagan. You might remember Reagan's famous phrase, Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall, about the Berlin Wall. And in those days, the Soviet Union controlled all of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. These countries over here were actually part of the Soviet Union, what they called Russian or Soviet Socialist Republics. And they are the Baltic Republics, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, that's this one right over here. Chernobyl is right here. This is the Ukraine. And this big one over here is today Russia. At that time it was the Soviet Socialist Republic of Russia. This is Kazakhstan over here, and that's Mongolia, which was always a separate country. And then there's a couple little smaller ones right over here on the border of Afghanistan, which is right over here. The Russians got involved in the war in Afghanistan that really weakened them. And on top of that, there was a Cold War, and anybody who's over about 40 years old remembers jumping under the desk and worrying about nuclear war all the way into the 80s. there was a gigantic buildup of arms, mostly nuclear arms and missiles, so on and so forth. At the top, the Russians had about 15,000 nuclear bombs. We had on the order of 20,000. And there was a hair trigger. Anybody made a mistake, anybody do something stupid. In fact, there was almost a nuclear war over a computer error at one point. There was definitely tension every second, every day. Then Reagan negotiated what they call the START agreements, and there was a law that was passed called Nunn-Lugar, which kind of helped enforce agreements to reduce nuclear arms. And the promoters of those agreements, called the START talks and then nuclear arms reduction agreements, was Reagan, who was a very famous U.S. president, and Gorbachev. Now, meanwhile, there was ideological tension. Reagan was definitely an anti-communist. He was a conservative Republican. Gorbachev was still a communist, but he was wavering in his intensity, and he started something called glasnost and started to ease up on the Russian economic system. That was already being done by the Chinese, who were transforming themselves into the economic power they are today at the very, very beginning, and loosening up, getting foreign investment, and so on and so forth. So the Russians started loosening up theirs, and also loosening up their media system as well, in allowing some dissident voices to come out, some independent media, so on and so forth. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell right here, and East Germany opened up its border to actually mostly to another communist country at that time, which was Czechoslovakia, now Czech Republic and Slovakia. And lots and lots of refugees started leaving Germany and leaving East Germany and going to West Germany. So finally, there was so much tension built up that there was a big giant demonstration in East Berlin, which is right over here, and they literally started tearing down the Berlin Wall. And at that point, the communist governments of Poland, Czech, East Germany, Hungary, all fell, and they opened up to Europe, and they became Western-oriented democracies and governments. Right now, you'll find that Poland, Czech, Slovakia, Hungary, all of these countries are now parts of the European Union, and also NATO has expanded as well. I'm not sure which ones joined NATO and which ones didn't, but I know Poland joined NATO, and West Germany took over East Germany and combined it into one big country. That's why you don't see a line going, yellow line going up here. So that all happened between 1989 and 1991. 1991, there was a counter coup by communist-oriented generals against Gorbachev. Right over here in the Kremlin, in the Crimea, which is a resort area along this Black Sea in southern Russia, they actually took Gorbachev prisoner for a few days, and there was a confrontation in Moscow itself. Moscow had been becoming more and more free, I guess you'd say it, or less and less communist. And in Russia itself, and I visited it myself, they have what they call the White House. There's the Kremlin, where the actual government of the Soviet Union was, now the government of Russia. Then there was a parliament building, which was the parliament of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. And there was a certain individual who became very, very famous, who got on top of a tank. It was surrounded by the coup people who had called out Russian soldiers to surround the White House. And there was a confrontation, and the head of the confrontation on the Democratic or the anti-communist side is a guy named Boris Yeltsin. And finally, the coup plotters collapsed. They released Gorbachev, and by that time, these other little Soviet republics started to declare their independence, and the Soviet Union fell apart. The first president of the post-Soviet Russian Republic was Boris Yeltsin. Now, as Boris Yeltsin had liberalized the economy, he did it in a sense that it became liberal and privatized, but there was no sense of order. And on top of that, not only was there no sense of order, there was really no law. So what had happened was Russia was taken over, especially Moscow and St. Petersburg, the two biggest cities, by mafias. And literally, they were fighting on the streets. The mafias started casinos. It was a lot like Chicago in 1925, but at the same time, big Western money were coming in, importing products, Mercedes-Benz. I met one guy who brought in from Germany or Austria, I think he was, car parts for Mercedes-Benz, luxury cars. And a group of people called the oligarchs, or the New Russians, became very, very rich. The government decided to take on what they called the Chicago model. And the Chicago model was privatization of what they government assets. And of course, in Russia and under communism, everything was government asset. Houses, apartment buildings, utilities, all the companies, and there was really no market per se. The government told each one of the businesses or each one of the industries how much they should produce. Those are called quotas, and they either made their quota, and if they made their quota, they were lionized and so on and so forth. The result was a complete mess, shortages in things that shouldn't have had shortages in products that they had plenty of, and much too much of steel and stuff like that may have been needed in a free market, but was certainly not needed then. So the result was a complete mess. Fighting in the streets, different mafia groups fighting one another. And then there were these rigged privatizations where for just the equivalent of a dime, for a pittance, the largest companies in Russia were sold off to these private entrepreneurs. And these private entrepreneurs became called oligarchs. There were a number of oligarchs, some of whom were very, very famous. A lot of the oligarchs became enemies of Putin when he took over. And they took over different businesses and different industries. And it was very, very similar to our trust era of J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and the railroad barons and so on and so forth, except this was Russian style. And some of the specific oligarchs are Chubais and Gaidar. They're still there. And they were called the Young Reformers. And probably the most famous is a fellow named Vladimir Guzinski. He took over and started independent media, started a TV and movie empire and radio empire throughout Russia. He's been run out when Putin took over. The government took over all of the big media companies, and of course the biggest was Guzinski's, called Media Most, and it had independent kind of 60-minute type shows, independent networks, and so on and so forth, and lots they controlled the cable and so on and so forth. So he was run out. Number of them were Roman Abramovich, was Sibneft Oil, which was taken over by Gazprom. That's the other big oil company. Of course, everybody has heard about Lukos Oil. Lukos Oil was controlled by a guy named Khodorkovsky and I believe a guy named Letvin. The first one was jailed by the Russians a couple years early, and then in 1993, Putin had Khodorkovsky arrested for tax evasion. Of course, none of the oligarchs pay taxes, so basically it's a crime that either everybody in Russia commits from the top to the bottom. So when the government arrests you for tax evasion, basically they're arresting you for being a Russian. And what happened was they wanted Lukoil, and they sold and forced Lukoil to be sold to the Gazprom, which had been taken over by Medvedev, who is the deputy prime minister of Russia under Putin. And he's one of the first of Putin's oligarchs, new billionaires who are beholden to Putin himself. Among the old famous billionaires, there's Berezovsky, and he was a banker, I believe, and he fled to England. And there is a story today about Berezovsky over here. Now, an interesting thing about Berezovsky is that he was the patron of Litvinov. There was a story a couple months ago about a Russian who was poisoned with polonium-210. And it was right after he had met with some Russian businessmen from Europe, and these Russian businessmen were associated with Putin and his regime. This guy was given actually caused to swallow a very, very highly radioactive material called polonium-210. And it was almost like the movie DOA. I don't know if anybody's seen that, with Dennis Quaid. And basically, if you get radiation poisoning that way, you're going to die, but you might die in a week or two. And in that particular movie, he was poisoned with this radioactive material. He went looking for his murderers. Well, this almost exactly happened to Litvinov, and Litvinov went public. He was kind of a media hound anyway. He was an ex-cop who exposed corruption, was run out of the Soviet Union, went to England, and he started working for Berezovsky. Now, Berezovsky was actually the moneybags of that operation, and it's possible that Litvinov, who died about 2 weeks after that, big scandal all over Europe. As a matter of fact, they traced the radioactivity from this polonium. It was so intense from Germany and Belgium back to Russia. It was really a bizarre incident and got a lot of attention. But in fact, Litvinov had been working for Berezovsky, and Berezovsky he was a billionaire. He sold off all of his assets. He escaped before he was arrested, and now apparently Putin's regime wants to charge him with various crimes, financial crimes. Mostly, they claim that he stole $50 million from the Russian airline, Aeroflot, and he had I think he owned Aeroflot too, Berezovsky, and he had tremendous power within Russia, owned a lot of businesses, and he was an oligarch, he was a billionaire. So basically, Berezovsky had an interview with a British paper called The Guardian, in which he advocated that Putin be overthrown by force. This, of course, has really upset the British, and the British are now investigating Berezovsky. Berezovsky has a big private foundation and funnels money to opposition groups and to political groups throughout Russia. What has happened since Putin took over? Putin took over in the late 90s. The first thing he did was appoint a mayor of Moscow who basically hired a whole bunch of ex-special forces and ex-KGB to take on the mafia, ran the mafia out of Moscow, which was quite an event. It made both the mayor of Moscow, his name was, I believe, Lyushkov, and Putin very, very popular in Russia. And then Putin started going after the oligarchs. The first thing he did, he went after Guzinsky, and he took over the largest private broadcaster and the largest private radio stations, and brought them into his party, which is called United Russia. And Putin just became consolidated economic and political power bit by bit by bit over a period of 6 or 7 years. He's run twice. In Moscow, the present constitution allows for allows for elections. They do have elections, and actually up to now, since Yeltsin, the elections have been pretty free. There's a lot of different political parties. But one by one, the leaders of the other political parties have been run out of the country, accused of one crime or another, picked up, and so on and so forth. Putin, who is very, very popular in Russia, he's basically stabilized it. Not only has he stabilized it, but he's built these tremendous, and I've done shows about it, oil pipelines and natural gas pipelines to Europe. And the result of that has been pouring in billions and billions and billions of dollars to a company that is controlled by Putin. Actually, it's controlled by his second in command, Medvedev, which is Gazprom. That's the gas monopoly for Russia that never was privatized completely, and that took over Lukoil and Abramovich's company, the two biggest oil companies. So now almost all the oil, almost all the natural gas that's exported from Russia is controlled by Putin and by the Putin's new oligarchs. Now, meanwhile, Putin has been going after the oligarchs that escaped. One called Gaydenov, it's Gayden, not sure exactly how to pronounce it, escaped. Gaidayak, I think it is, escaped to Israel. He happened to have been Jewish. Guzinski ended up in Greece, and of course Berezovsky, who's probably the most politically powerful of the opposition oligarchs, ended up in England. And there's a few more that have escaped into various countries. These guys still have billions, even though they were forced to sell their assets at the beginning of the Putin era. They were smart enough to sell it at the beginning, and they ended up in Europe with tremendous personal assets, literally billions of dollars. And those billions of dollars have been going into opposition groups, opposition media, so on and so forth within Russia, and Putin has been responding in kind. Meanwhile, tremendous amounts of money have been pouring from Europe, which is dependent on Russia for energy. Europe tried to become independent of the Arabs, the Persian Gulf potentates over here for energy. Instead, they turned to Putin's Russia, and gigantic oil pipeline was built through the Ukraine over to Hungary. Another one goes over the Baltic and into Germany. Another one goes from Belarus down into Poland. It's incredible. And then the Europeans have been trying to get around it by building a pipeline from Azerbaijan over to Georgia and down here to port in Turkey so that they can ship oil back up here. And there might be a gas pipeline that might accompany it. And also they're trying to get the biggest, second biggest reserves in that area are Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is talking about laying a underwater pipeline over the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan, hooking up to this pipeline, which could get up to 10 million barrels a day. It's big enough, has a capacity, even though it only gets 1 to 2 million barrels a day out of Azerbaijan. So, that's Europe's attempt to try to free themselves from Russia and from Putin. Meanwhile, Putin has said that he's not going to cooperate with NATO. And NATO wants to put anti-missile missiles over here in, I believe, Lithuania, Poland, and some other places, and which have joined NATO. Ostensibly, these are PAC-3s to oppose and to block nuclear weapons from North Korea, which is a rogue state, and from Iran, which would definitely come over this area. Here's Iran over here, in order to attack Europe. But it's unlikely that Iran would attack Europe, since Europe has big, giant export contracts with Iran. So the Russians feel that that's directed at themselves. Meanwhile, according to the Russian Constitution, Putin cannot run again and has to step down after the elections in May of '08. My name is Reed Silverne. The name of the show is Fed Pride, trying to give a little background on what's going on in Russia. I'll be on Tuesday, Thank you.